Racial Occupation, An American Nightmare, PT 2. Disclaimer. This post will discuss heavy topics that may invoke uncomfortable feelings. The topic of race and racism, extreme violence, and triggering words will be used. This is for educational purposes. Fact check everything. This post is not made to harass anyone. It is not made to bully anyone. It is not a targeting anyone. It is not made to promote hate based on identity, gender, race, religion, or ethnicity, etc. It is the discussion of race and race relations. This is a snowflake disclaimer. I am not discussing any individual. This is an analysis of Black society and issues. If you disagree, please state why or call out anything. This is made to discuss these issues, and hopefully I can learn something new through these exchanges. Racial slurs will be referenced. In this discussion, let's 1. Remember the human, deconstructing racism, and European society can be an intense subject. Remember the human. 2. Behave like you would in real life. 3. Look for the original source of the content, which this is the OG. 4. I have searched for duplicates, and I have written it, and if asked, I can provide sources. 5. Be real, mask off, with one another is the only rule of the community. Black Americans are an amalgamated ethnic group within the USA, historically having lived under racial occupation in the USA. An internal colonization effort cleverly propagated as integration, which, just like the assimilation program, sought to genocide the population via absorption, as the descendants of enslaved Black people were slowly integrated and assimilated into the greater American culture and society, effectively erasing efforts of Black empowerment, which now are done through symbolic gestures such as representation or celebratory acts. In the coming days or weeks, I will be discussing and addressing many topics. My current position is simple. White supremacy was repackaged and rebranded. White supremacy is a religion that has its own mythology. The mythology was transported into stereotypes of race. Race itself is a European model of thinking that was an ideology, a worldview, a paradigm, and a belief system. It has been heavily whitewashed to simply mean racial prejudices, but this simply distorts centuries of art, science, and culture dating back to medieval Europe, when these ideas were first being proposed through European royal courts. Yes, I am angry. I am very angry, actually. When I see the current state of my people, although resilient, I don't see much as change except the stockade walls being invisible. White societies not only got away with crimes against humanity, they have lied, gaslit, and whitewashed history. While things have virtually only been symbolic changes, they have hid our history. What is racial occupation? Racial occupation is the systematic control and subjugation of Black people in the USA during slavery and the subsequent periods post-slavery. It is the remnants of a social order that was maintained under the guise of emancipation, not liberation. Racial occupation, what I will sometimes symbolize as the stockade, stresses the enforced control and dominance people labeled Negro endured within the nation-state territories of the USA. This also includes the people who we have classified as Native American, as many were classified as Negro. The term brings to mind conditions where a racial group is subjected to systemic control through social and legal discrimination, akin to an occupied territory. Cultural crimes. Let's analyze some of the features of this system. 1. Legal, economic, political, and social disenfranchisement, LEPS. Black Americans were disenfranchised via LEPS, an intertwined system that reflects the ideology of white supremacy and hegemony. A white supremacist is simply someone who subscribes to the idea of white superiority in race and culture. They believe in the race theory, tenet of the religious or mythological side of white supremacy, and they can be a person of any race or ethnicity. There were two wings or houses of this ideology that both had different viewpoints in how to interact with those they have colonized. Black in the USA is defined as the descendant of an enslaved person, whereas white was defined as a free, land-owning person. These would change as time passed by to conform to the race theory that was developing globally. Black or Negro would come to mean enslaved African, even though it wasn't exclusively African people being enslaved, and white would come to mean European, even though not all Europeans were white. There were also definitions for Native Americans who were reclassified many times, and there was the term mulatto, colored, etc., that oftentimes simply meant non-white. We will address these classification systems in another post, but for now, just know that Black in the USA was defined as the descendants of an enslaved person. Legal. Black Americans were legally discriminated against in order to maintain the social order. Slave codes, laws enacted from the 17th and 18th centuries in America, defined the status of enslaved people and the rights the slavers had over them. The codes were colorized under the legal definition of color, and they were designed over a period of time to deprive enslaved people of legal rights, effectively dehumanizing them to be simply property of the slavers. Dred Scott. Decision of 1857 displays this in that it was ruled Black people, whether enslaved statute or freed status, could not be an American citizen, and therefore had no right to sue in federal courts. We were given civil rights, or the right to participate in society, undermining the natural right theory that we are born with. During the era titled Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, neo-slavery would be born and continued for another 100 years, thus continuing the racial occupation of Black people. Black codes passed in the South were passed that maintained the racial social order, and violence, or the threat of violence and neo-slavery via imprisonment, was used to maintain social control. The good old days, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was not enforced. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared all persons born in the United States to be citizens, without distinction of race or color, or previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. Racial occupation would continue also during what is labeled the Jim Crow era of 1877 and 1965, in which state and local laws enforced racial segregation primarily in the southern states, although it was also practiced in the northern states. It is never as highlighted as it is for the South. The laws mandated that a racial segregation in public be enforced. A system propagated as separate but equal, of course, with it being an unequal system that was used to legally terrorize Black Americans and feed neo-slavery while maintain the social order. As seen in Plessy v. Ferguson, the occupiers upheld the constitutionality of racial occupation via segregation under the separate but equal doctrine, voting restrictions via poll taxes, literacy tests, and the grandfather clause, which allowed occupiers, the descendants of colonizers, to bypass literacy tests and other obstacles if their grandfathers had the right to vote, which effectively excluded Black people. These are just a few examples of the legal trickery occupiers used to discriminate Black people. The legacy and remnants of these systems would be rebranded. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 would come via the Civil Rights Movement, where the integrationist backed by white liberals, fueled by white anxieties, would choose internal colonization via integration, assimilation programs. White liberals had adopted the tenet of white supremacy, of the white man's burden, which is a socio-religious belief that it was the duty and moral obligation of the white supremacist to civilize the non-white populations they colonized. This was, of course, used to justify brutal and inhumane crimes against humanity during the 19th and 20th centuries. The Civil Rights Act wasn't created to give specific protections to Black Americans. Racial occupation would continue under the guise of different forms, as occupiers would only rebrand their subjugation of Black Americans. They had prevented Haiti, Liberia, and Brazil from happening, and used propaganda to successfully get Black Americans nationwide to accept internal colonization. Brown v. Board, Fair Housing Act of 1968. Voting Rights Act of 1965, etc., were all legal machinations used to constrict or relieve social pressures while either maintaining the social order and religious ethos of white supremacy. There were two different legal systems in the USA, the remnants still being seen today, a social legal system and a political legal system. Economic exploitation is central to the Black experience, as enslaved people were legally considered property and were forced through the threat of violence and death to work without compensation. This system generated immense wealth that benefited white society. Even Black people who were freed faced severe economic restrictions that limited the type of work they could do. The system of neo-slavery is never brought up and is largely ignored by U.S. educational system. This system was engineered to continue slavery via legal barriers mentioned above: employment discrimination, convict leasing, peonage, exclusion from the New Deal, etc. We had Black people who went and fought wars only to come home and face LEPS discrimination. The Federal Housing Administration practiced redlining, which denied mortgages to Black Americans and confined them to certain neighborhoods that were racially occupied by state enforcers. This affected the way Black Americans could generate wealth through land ownership and property. Not to mention the many accounts of successful Black towns or settlements that were raided and dismantled for being successful, to outright being stolen by occupiers and justified by a justice system that turned a blind eye, many of whom are still being denied reparations. Black Wall Street survivors. There were discriminatory lending practices where banks and lending institutions continued these practices by offering subprime loans to Black borrowers at higher rates than to white borrowers with similar credit profiles. This is a practice continued today with predatory lending companies that target areas affected by racial occupation. These practices would effectively create an underclass and a cheap labor force that contributed to a wealth gap we see present in today's society. Note, this was exhaustive. Not all Black people were poor. There was a system that was engineered to impoverish and disenfranchise Black people. But there were Black people who beat the odds and had their own communities, some of which were systematically dismantled through the war on drugs, internal colonization. Although through internal colonization, a lot of Black families participated in social mobility, this was a desired effect in order to rubber band theory or milk and coffee, the Black Power movements. Political. The Black status condition denoted that an enslaved person and their descendants were not citizens and had no political rights. This was, of course, racialized despite a person being free or enslaved, later imprisoned. The 3/5 Compromise of 1787 counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation and taxation, which increased the political power of slaver states. During racial occupation, amendments such as the 13th, 14th, and 15th were designed to grant freedom and citizenship to non-occupiers, but their implementation faced resistance on every level of LEPS, as we have seen above in the L&E discussions. We have discussed how poll taxes, literacy tests, and the grandfather clauses were designed to disenfranchise Black Americans, and one day, we will expand on each acronym of LEPS. Let's explore some other political machinations the occupiers used. White primaries in some states were instruments in which only white voters were allowed to vote. Gerrymandering was used to draw electoral district boundaries to dilute the voting power of occupied communities, which continues today. Voter ID laws are another tool often politicized and designed to affect Black voters. Felon disenfranchisement has its roots in racial occupation, dating back during the eras they call Reconstruction and Jim Crow. They concocted social crimes to effectively create a system of neo-slavery where the propaganda of Black criminality would be used to justify it. The tough-on-crime rhetoric is colorful word usage to appeal to the occupiers, dog whistle euphemism, to say keeping black people in the stockades. The white anxieties mythos, in the form of black savages running rampant to corrupt them and their societies. Social. All of these combined displayed a social order that was maintained through legal, economic, political systems. Not only this, but it also has features of religious exploitation, as the mind of Black Americans were conditioned mainly using religious themes. Socially, LEP created an environment that reflected the social consciousness of Americans. It reflected white supremacy socially, in the culture as well. From education through funding disparities in occupied schools, healthcare discrimination through occupied hospitals and medical experimentations, public accommodations and failed infrastructure, employment discrimination, restrictive covenants, etc., not to mention the social discrimination in the forms of entertainment and culture that manifested in minstrel shows. Exploitation of black music and musicians have been discussed for decades, as black music and culture is constantly commodified and cannibalized by white consumers in many forms. The exclusion yet usage of black entertainment, from stereotyping to typecasting, censorship and suppression, sports, cultural theft, media marginalization, appropriation, mockery, etc., the list goes on and on as the roots run deep, are all symptomatic of racial occupation theory. LEPS is expression of the religious ideology of white supremacy. 2. Militarized or state enforcement. The creation of modern policing in the USA is quite interesting, as policing has its roots in slave patrols, which can be traced back to the 1700s, starting in South Carolina and spreading throughout the South. The slave patrols were contractors who were tasked with catching and beating escaped enslaved people, prevention of slave revolts and uprising, and policing communities via crime suppression tactics. They patrolled to maintain civil order by monitoring and controlling the movements of enslaved people. These were the enforcers of racial occupation. They would conduct raids and searches without cause or warrant to seize educational materials and even Bibles to maintain the social order. These early groups would evolve into modern policing by establishing the practices to enforce the laws, but they were formal police. The patrols weren't about just catching runaway slaves. They used violence to enforce the social order. The slave patrols were equipped with guns and whips to exert control. They monitored the movement and activities of enslaved people by the searches and watching their gatherings, oftentimes having an informant amongst the enslaved population. They suppressed potential revolts and defiance amongst enslaved people using intimidation while being empowered by the state and receiving little to no accountability for their crimes. Ordinary white citizens participated in the policing efforts. Shire Reeve originated in medieval England. It was the office of the sheriff that was responsible for tax collection and enforcing law and order. This would be implemented in English colonies throughout the empire. As the Virginia colony grew, Jamestown 1634, local courts, magistrates, and sheriffs were established, which could be argued to be the formal beginning of law enforcement in America. The Boston Watch System, 1935, was a voluntary service to watch for fires and petty crimes, but it didn't have a serious legal authority from the state. This attempt at whitewashing the tradition racial occupation via state-enforced violence that police has origins in. Employed former slave patrollers as police officers maintained a large force to control black populations. The KKK has its roots in these slave patrollers as well, and it is intrinsically linked to racial occupation and maintain the social order. We will dive deeper into in later posts. The police force has been militarized in recent years. Black America has existed as a police state. The police enforced black codes and arrested black people for minor infractions such as vagrancy and loitering, and many other culture crimes to fuel neo-slavery. They turned a blind eye and participated in racial violence carried out by hate groups. The police has always been a tool to enforce the social order. In the 1970s, under the Nixon administration, the war on drugs was declared by the occupier Richard Nixon. It was really a war on Black America because it targeted Black communities through aggressive policing and mass incarceration, further disenfranchising Black people through LEPs. It went into high gear during the Reagan administration. The war on Black America contributed to the militarization of the police force because they received military-grade equipment and adopted aggressive tactics like no-no raids and SWAT deployments in communities of color. The police has always been used as gatekeepers as well by guarding the borders of predominantly white cities and neighborhoods to maintain the racial occupation. From gated communities and private security being physical barriers implemented to the walls of the metaphorical stockade public spaces, like parks, shopping and recreational facilities, etc., in predominantly white areas, see stricter policing where Black people are scrutinized and watched more. The neighborhood watch being born from the same traditions that fueled sundown towns. Black people and predominant Black communities are still under racial occupation to this day with the same rhetoric, perhaps worded differently, being used to justify it. 3. Internal colonization. Integration from the very beginning was the white liberal, ideological co-opted by Black and white people standpoint propagated by the integrationist of the civil rights movement. We will discuss how the movements was actually a bundle of different Black ideologies and leaders looking to solve the issue for Black Americans, and how MLK was propped up by white liberals and the Black bourgeoisie to push for integration, now rebranded as symbolic representation. It functioned as a form of internalized colonization for Black Americans by imposing the dominant white culture onto Black America while suppressing and absorbing Black people and Black culture. We are talking about beauty standards, media and entertainment, education, employment, housing and urban development, and gentrification. The dismantling of Black communities via flooding the streets with drugs and then arresting the people in that community for it. Health, politics, and activism. Black people were confined to certain areas, which were then heavily policed. This continues to this day, although a lot of pressure has been relieved. It's the rubber band effect that allows some Black Americans to advance their stations and participate in the social mobility of the USA in order to dilute Black power efforts on a mass level. They have been quite successful in placating Black America by dilution and symbolic gestures aimed at representations rather than substantial changes. This is why I call it racial occupation. They suppressed the truth and told Black America to get over it, while whitewashing the history because if we knew, we'd know that LEPs of racial occupation never ended and continues to this day. This isn't to say that progress hasn't been made or the Black people LEPs hasn't improved via Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and with increased representation in media and politics. My arguments are that massively, it wasn't the best route for Black American, and it is mostly symbolic gestures to appease and placate rather than improve and empower. It's the bootstrap ideology, while that tightened boot is still on your neck, and when it's slowly raised off, and your neck is still as pain, it's the get over it. A lot of Black Americans have achieved significant economic success through this flawed system, but we accomplished the same thing while racially occupied at many other points when we were left alone. The system allows for social mobility via capitalism if we play their game and rules or commodify ourselves or people in media. There are symbolic reforms ongoing to address police brutality and systemic racism. And let's not forget the global commodification or dominance of Black culture. We've even had a Black president. I think these were small sacrifices in the grand scheme. It is under a facade. I know my viewpoint of internal colonization or my claim of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 won't be a universally accepted viewpoints. We are still under racial occupation. Closing remark. Something important to note here is that there has always been Black people who adopted the religion of white supremacy and acted in the best interest of white society over Black America. They believe in the Eurocentric race theory and have been conditioned, assimilated, integrated fully into their society, and all they truly want from white society is representation, not substantial change for all. They are the colorblind and the internalized racist amongst us. Despite the brand they chose to express their racist ideology and worldview, their primarily goal is to benefit from this system by conforming to the ideas of this society. They often have a vested interest in its continuation, even at the expense of their own people. Black bourgeoisie and Liberia, as there were free people of color, Creoles, Native Americans, both sometimes classified as mulatto, that owned enslaved people, Native Americans, white, black, etc. In this specific case, we are talking about the black people who helped white supremacists and some that enriched themselves. I will write about how the modern black American elite are really enemies in the way of progress. Remember, there were black slave owners, Anthony Johnson, the DeQueer family, Creole, William Ellison, Cyprien Ricard, Antoine Dubuclet, Marie-Therese Metoyer, Justice Angel and Mistress L. Horry, Andrew Durnford, John Carruthers Stanley, etc. A lot of them owning more than 50-plus slaves, and some like even in the 100s.